Today I'm starting a new YouTube channel. Some of you may know me from a gaming channel where I'm Tachyon Lance. This channel is going to be about China and the United States, the greatest competition most likely of the 21st century, how this impacts our daily lives, how this will impact worldwide events that we are currently seeing, the trends that will most likely unfold over the next 20 years or so. As you can see here, there's the world map. This is China. You can see here in the Asia Pacific region. Now, I am based in Australia, as some of you will know, and probably can tell from my voice. So this does greatly impact my life and that of my family, and that's an area I've been interested in for quite a long time. I'm very interested in geostrategic events around the world, and it'll be predominantly with the United States. Obviously, there's been a lot in the media over recent years of the competition between the United States versus the People's Republic of China and the growing strategic rivalry and perhaps the dawn of a new Cold War. I believe we're already in a Cold War, and we have been for a number of years, and a bit like the first Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the United States and its Western allies in Western Europe and NATO. It took from about 1947 until about the mid or early 1950s, really, for the West and the United States to really wake up and realise that it was in a real Cold War and respond to that. There were some events, and probably the Berlin crisis. The Berlin airlift was one of the main events which would have triggered it, and Churchill's remarks about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. But until the United States was very reluctant, and Europeans were very reluctant to declare a Cold War, because they just experienced, over the last 40 years, two world wars which had devastated much of Europe, brought down the empires of France and Britain, so the French Empire, the British Empire, even the Italian Empire had, Libya and Somalia and a few other little areas. But predominantly, even though these empires had not fallen by that stage, they were in rapid decline, and they both knew that they could no longer afford the global empires that they had, and that the rising powers, or the actual risen powers of the USSR and the United States, they could just no longer compete. They were just far too small to be able to compete. So it took some time for the first Cold War to be formally declared and everyone to know it as a Cold War, and that strategic competition to really heat up as the USSR got its nuclear weapons and its arsenal grew, and then the United States responded, and it was direct competition back and forth until the late 80s and very early 1990s when the Soviet Union disintegrated. We're in a similar phase now to probably that later 1940s to early 1950s, where the United States and its allies are reluctant to call this a Cold War, even though they probably understand that it is. They call it strategic competition. And the People's Republic of China, the PRC, do not want to label it as a Cold War either, because what China fears most is being contained, being surrounded. And if they label it a Cold War, then it implies the formation of NATO-style alliances and blocs. And China does not want blocs to form. It is the biggest threat to China of blocs forming, which would contain it within its geographical area. And the reason why this is a problem is because of its geography. It's one of the reasons Taiwan is such a key issue. We'll talk more about that later. But you can see the geography here with Japan stretching down along here. Well, this is parts of this is Russia up there, but there's parts of the Japanese archipelago, and it stretches, if you zoom in, it stretches all the way down here. And Japan actually has islands all the way down here, and they've actually fortified a lot of these areas, and they are continuing to do so, and then installing long-range anti-ship missiles and ground to surface, ground to air missiles, or SAM sites along here, and their navies patrol through here. So this is quite a formidable island chain to get past. And then you've got Taiwan, that link, and then it goes down here into the Philippines, and then down here into Malaysia and Indonesia and so on, Singapore. So it's quite a large natural barrier. And it's one of the reasons why the Chinese have claimed that 9-dash line through this area. They're trying to claim all the natural resources and fisheries and all these islands, Spratly Islands here. And there's been a lot of contention lately with the Philippines and China over, I think it was Mischief. Is it Mischief Reef? I think it is. But here there's been a lot of news lately because they've got a ship which has been basically rammed on a reef about 20 odd years ago for the Philippines to claim that island and stop the Chinese basically building a base on it and doing what they've done everywhere else and reclaim the land from the sea and build big fortresses on all these islands throughout. You know, the Paso Islands and Vietnam are competing there, China and Vietnam competing there. Spratlys is most competition between all of these countries, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines and China. But the Chinese are trying to control, it's not predominantly for the resources, for gas, oil and the fish, maybe the fish, but this is predominantly the stocks here are going to dwindle with all these nations competing for it. But it's more because they've got large naval bases here on Hainan Island, including nuclear ballistic missile submarines, which need a secure route to be able to patrol and get out of here. So controlling the South China Sea is one of those areas, and it links right down here to Singapore and the Malacca Strait, which is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, or is the world's busiest shipping lane. And you can see here at its narrowest point, trying to come through here or through here, it's extremely narrow. And you think in a war situation how easy it is to blockade this area. And for China, 80% of its oil comes through these straits, predominantly from the Persian Gulf, through the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Qatar, all these other Middle Eastern countries, and also from various areas in Africa which have oil deposits as well. So you can see that for the shipping to come through here, it is very important for China to be able to control this area, project power into this area, and if needed, project power into this area. And there could be a significant argument for China to, in the event of any future conflict with the United States, that it would rapidly want to secure this location. Singapore would be a prime target because of the need to control this strait. If China cannot project power into this area, then the only other avenues to get its ships through are through choke points like this, choke points through here, through the Indonesian archipelago, and that brings it much closer to Australia, which the United States has air bases, able to use air bases. You've got an air base out here near Derby, Curtin Air Force Base, where there it is, Curtin Air Force Base there, which is not too far from Indonesia. You've also got air bases in the Northern Territory, one being Tyndall Air Force Base, which is out this way. You should be able to see it there. Yep. And the United States is building up fuel dumps and infrastructure at these air bases, particularly in the Northern Territory. There's been B-2 bombers recently come here, B-52 bombers, and the reason for that is because they can project power from Australia flying into the South China Sea. Now that's probably I think it's about 5,000 kilometres roughly, 5,000 to 6,000 kilometres. So it is a long trip, but nothing for a strategic bomber. A strategic bomber would be able to get aerial refueling over this area, easily make it into this region and into the southern China, particularly around the Taiwan area, with little problems at all. And this is well outside China's ability to intercept or play havoc with aerial refueling aircraft for strategic bombers. So, but we won't get too much into that. But you can see their strategic situation of China's ability to get oil from the Middle East into this area. Now, there are some ports in Pakistan where the Chinese are building up pipelines and trying to build up infrastructure to get oil which can be transited through here and stop here, and then get pipelines built through Pakistan and all the way across China. But obviously this is very vulnerable oil pipelines. This goes through tribal areas of Pakistan. You've got all this mountainous area here, close to India as well, and Afghanistan, very unstable part of the region. So you don't want to be relying on that. And I know it takes a few cruise missiles to destroy that pipeline as well. And also it's very vulnerable to the US Navy, the port line there. And the US Navy does dominate the Persian Gulf and most of the open oceans at this point in time. So you can see that it's not an easy problem to solve, and China does get increasing resources from Russia with oil and gas, but that only amounts to, I think it's 5 to 7, 8% of China's daily needs in terms of oil. That will increase over time, but it takes a long time to build up the oil infrastructure to send oil from Russia's oil fields into China. And a lot of Russia's infrastructure is set up to go to the West or Europe. They can't just quickly reorientate its pipelines. All its infrastructure is built up over many decades to then go to China. It requires huge investments, and a lot of the global oil companies which helped Russia build this infrastructure are no longer able to help it because of the sanctions. So they've pulled out, and Russia is likely going to face declining oil production over the future because of being able to maintain its pipelines and finding the capital needed to invest in future developments inside of Russia. So that's another problem. And that's also, the pipelines are also vulnerable to attack in event of a war on China's side of the border. You only have to hit some pipelines or storage depots, and that would be the end of the supply from Russia. So you can see the problem that China will face in that side of conflict. So that's why this the strategic situation of China in a geographical sense is so difficult, because it really feels hemmed in what we call the first island chain. And China's strategic aims will be to push back United States influence to the second island chain, which is the series of islands out in the mid-Pacific, like Guam. You got Palau, you got Wake, you got Midway out here, and Hawaii is really part of the third island chain, and the Indonesian archipelago, Australia. That all forms sort of part of the second island chain. The third island chain is more Hawaii and further back there. So you've got, China has a real strategic dilemma. How does it combat the situation that it's in? Well, on the other hand, its main competitor, the United States, enjoys the strategic position of having large oceans on either side of it, weaker neighbours being Canada and Mexico, which are of no military threat other than the drug cartels and that type of thing coming in the southern border, which is a threat, and you could have some, say, terrorists and things like that cross the border. Okay, that is a threat to the United States and couldn't cause significant problems, but it's not a existential threat where the whole country could be under threat in a situation as a peer competitor which has nuclear weapons like China or Russia. Much more in China's situation, because it has the economic potential to challenge the United States over the longer term. So the United States is able, and it is the only true superpower in modern history, which is able to project power from its home base to anywhere in the globe, knowing that it's safe at home. The United States enjoys this basically a central position in the world in terms of the North American continent, and it can project power where needed. It can project most of its power into the Pacific against China if it needed to, or it can project power to Europe to combat Russia if needed, which it predominantly did during the USSR in the Cold War. So it projected power to Europe, reinforced NATO so that the Soviet Union could not dominate Europe, and then it could then project its power to the North American continent. That's what the United States was trying to prevent. And the old strategic situation is that whoever dominates this Eurasian continent dominates the world. So the United States does not want one power to dominate this entire region. And at the moment, it would be China would be the power which could dominate this region, because it is a large landmass, and it does project power deep into Central Asia. Its borders with Xinjiang, whatever you call it, and Tibet, project powers right into Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then India. And these, you can see the Himalayan mountains, or the Hindu Kush, as they call it, project right out in here to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan towards the Caspian Sea. Now, this is the problem the United States has. How does it, as a predominantly maritime power, prevent the formation of a large empire in this region? And we've seen over history, going back in terms of the Mongols, which dominated China, Russia, the Mongolian plateau, and then into Eastern Europe and Asia, Persia. That was probably one of the largest Eurasian powers. We had empires, various Chinese dynasties which projected power over large areas of the Eurasian continent, various Persian empires, obviously Russia for a long time, the Russian Empire for long periods of time, and even had the Roman Empire, but that was predominantly Mediterranean. It did project power into the Middle East, but for a long period of time it was in conflict with Parthia, which was the Persian Empire prior to it becoming Persia, and then you obviously had the rise of Islam and various Islamic empires and Ottoman empires and things which followed on. So the United States projects power to both Europe and Asia to prevent the formation of a power dominating the Eurasian continent, and that's why the alliance between, informal alliance between China and Russia, I guess it's a friendship without limits, as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin called it prior to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And that is what is the United States' biggest strategic problem presently. How do you combat the combined power of China and Russia? Because the situation that the United States would face, it would be a diabolical situation, is, for instance, if China was, say, to launch an attack on Taiwan, then you may have Russia at the same time launch an attack in Ukraine, which they've already done. Or perhaps, let's say, they were successful in Ukraine and they launched an attack into Poland or the Baltic states and tried to take that, and started a larger war in Europe. And this was happening at the same time as China was attacking Taiwan. And to attack Taiwan, China would most likely attack targets and US bases in Japan, including Okinawa, so that it could destroy US forces in Japan, because there's, between South Korea and Japan, there's some 80,000 US forces in this region. So significant US forces. So China would launch attacks into Japan, hit Japanese bases where US forces are located, maybe perhaps some Japanese bases, particularly anti-ballistic missiles and air defenses, air bases, perhaps even South Korea, now that South Korea is joining Japan and the United States in more likely a trilateral alliance. So, and this could allow the United States to use bases in South Korea, which I think they would use anyway, in the event of a conflict with China over Taiwan. So in the start of any conflict with Taiwan, you potentially have a situation where China has to attack South Korea and Japan, as well as the United States and Taiwan, to try and gain superiority in this region to prevent US forces from coming down from Japan and various bases here and intervening in the Taiwanese conflict, and projecting power from South Korea, or South Korea reinforcing Japan and then coming down to assist Taiwan. And you also have the Philippines, which is becoming probably more leaning towards the United States under its new government as well. And the US, under its new forces agreement with the Philippines, has some multiple new bases across the Pacific, or across the northern Philippines, so that it has, and a couple of these bases are just right up in here. I'm not sure if you can see where they are. I think one of them is around here. There's two up here anyway, so that they can easily project power to Taiwan. You can see how close this is. This is literally about what's that, about 300 kilometers across there. So you can see how close it is. It's so easy for aircraft to be able to cross here. And the problem for China is to stop reinforcements arriving in Taiwan, they need to control the oceans 360 degrees around Taiwan to prevent naval forces coming in and reinforcing Taiwan, because it's hard to get anti-ship missiles around here. You have to get aircraft around here or Navy ships around here to try and prevent reinforcements coming in from the east, flying in from the United States or from various other areas across the Pacific. So the United States has got more air bases here that it can utilise, and cross bases all around the Philippines that it can use to project power into Taiwan, let alone using some of these Japanese bases which are continually being built up to influence events in Taiwan. So you can see how difficult it would be for China to try and attack Taiwan. So how do you do that? Well, you need to dilute and distract predominantly the United States. So you do that with an alliance with Russia. Russia can attack in Europe, distracting the United States, draining US forces and allied forces in Europe. You can also have North Korea attack across the demilitarized zone into South Korea, or attack bases in Japan. It has its own nuclear arsenal, so that could quickly turn nuclear as well. So you could have a conflict with North Korea attacking South Korea, China attacking Taiwan, Russia attacking potentially various targets in Europe, and you could also have Iran. Iran could also start to intervene and take various actions across the Middle East to try and dominate this region, as well as they are closely aligned with China, Russia as well, and they get clandestine help from North Korea, which is well known. I'm just going to take a sip of my coffee. So that's the overall strategic situation, a brief overlay, and I'll be going to depth in a lot of these things in other videos and doing a deep dive on much of this. Today I wanted to kick off with the primary problem of the moment, and it is China's current economic situation. We've seen how the rise of China over the last few decades has changed the world, upended the global order, and it's also been a great benefit. We probably wouldn't have iPhones and a lot of the smartphones and technologies we have now in the palm of our hand, which cost $1,500 to $2,000 for some of the latest iPhones, which were built in China with US technology. And that's an endless stream of products which are mass produced in China or have been in the past, and just totally upended globalization and made things very affordable for many of the people around the world. And that is now spreading to areas such as India, Vietnam, and various Southeast Asian nations as manufacturing starts to shift out of China into other areas due to various costs and concerns, which is also an in-depth dive for another video. So today I wanted to focus now I've done a brief overview of what I'll be focusing on for the future, but I wanted to have a look at the current situation in China with its economic situation. So, and to show you that I do know a fair bit about what I'm talking about, is some of the history that I've had with events in China. And just to show you, and it will reveal some details, personal details about me, but that's fine, I don't mind. So this is a Quora post that I did back a couple of years ago. This was done over 1 year ago, which you can see here. It doesn't show the exact date, but it was well over a year ago. I might be able to bring up the date. Can I? No, it doesn't seem to want to show me the date. Hang on, let me see if I can bring up the date. So as you can see here, I've got a number of Quora posts. This is the one I'm going to click on here. This was in the 5th of January 2022. So this was prior to the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. And this was prior to all the economic collapses currently being experienced in China right now. So this was predominantly an article about the financial situations of some of China's coal industries and links to local government debt. So, and this, you can see this article was from late, it says 2021, yeah. So that's late December 2021. So this was some 20 months ago now. So this was the article that I linked to in here, in these various links here. So basically what I write about here, and you can have a read from the screen yourself. So it talked about China's current property development situation with some of its large property developers, such as Evergrande, which had a debt of over $300 billion at that time. And it was, I think it was in default for 150 billion. No, it wasn't 150 billion. It had 150 billion in shadow bank loans on top of the 300 billion. And that's a persistent problem we find in China, that they have a lot of off-the-books loans from local governments to state enterprises, all in the shadow banking area. So, or it's not correctly recorded as part of their financial documents, so that they don't have to disclose it to shareholders and part of their financial dealings. So, in terms of Evergrande, they had a lot more debt than they were revealing to the public, and what the media was reporting back a couple of years ago when this first started to unfold. And it's all unfolded now. We've seen Evergrande report, I think, losses of over $80 billion in the last few months. And they've gone into, technically they're bankrupt. They're basically bankrupt and they're going under, along with much of China's property sector at the moment. And we've seen other large property developers recently come out and they're filing for bankruptcy, or they're defaulting on debts and missing payments because of the spiraling economic effects of China's property sector. And to give you an example, with Evergrande and some of these Chinese property developers, how much debt they had. When you talk about, they had $300 billion listed debt that we knew of, and 150 billion in shadow banking debt, which is now, it's all come out. So about 450 billion in total debt. The largest indebted US company at the time, about 2 years ago, was AT&T, and they had $180 billion in debt. And that was the largest out of all the US corporations. So you can see the difference, and I guess the due diligence and regulations, and you got the press, the media, and all the your stockbrokers and all your investors doing all their due diligence and looking into everything. So because it's a much more transparent society in terms of comparison to China, where you can find information out. So it's important for companies to be transparent about their debts, and it's very hard to hide it in a Western system, because you've got your banks and that, and they disclose their loans and things like that as well, how much they're lending out and to who. So local governments, they've got a nice little trick that what they do, where they will lend out money to developers to basically buy up land from the local governments, and these are called financing vehicles, pretty much. And what the local governments do is, when there's no buyers for land to develop in their region, and they can't sell the land, they create a financing vehicle themselves, and then they get this financing vehicle to take out lots of loans, lots of it from shadow banking, because they don't really have much assets at that point, that without liabilities, and they go out and borrow money, and then they buy the money from buy the land from the local government. So you got technically a company created by the local government goes out and borrows money to then buy land from the local government at inflated prices, because that then gives revenue to the local governments for them to go and fund infrastructure spending on highways and fast rail and all the other new apartment blocks, or everything they need for to keep their economy going. And this is to meet those artificial growth targets that China the Chinese central government sets. So it might be, say, 6%, or it's going to be 5% this year. But to hit that 6%, so they need to borrow a certain amount of money, create a certain amount of economic activity. They'll get back to this more a bit later. But so they're setting artificial targets. They need to create so much economic growth, whether it's good or not, to hit these targets. So these local governors can say to Beijing, "Yep, I've hit my target. I've done a great job," and he keeps his position and doesn't end up getting the chop or the flick. So it's in his self-interest to do that, or their self-interest to do that. So you can see how local governments and even the sort of the state governments or the regions are incentivized for their own personal safety and security to hit these targets, to do loans and shadow banking and to do whatever they have to hit these targets or get as close to it as they can. So they created these financing vehicles to do that. The reason they created these financing vehicles is because of the property sector collapse, because of Evergrande and all these other developers going under. Because prior to this, the property developers would go to the local governments, buy up their land at inflated prices, and then the developers would go and build their apartment blocks and sell these on to the consumers at inflated prices again. And that's why prices are so high in China for property, and that's why people can only afford, if they're lucky, the 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in these apartment blocks, because everyone's taking such a large slice of the pie and prices have been pushed up so high. Now, the local governments at the time were getting 40 to 50% of their revenue from these property developers buying up their land or land sales. But land sales have been down across China over the last couple of years for over 70%. So where are these local governments getting their money from to fund their services and fund their infrastructure and to keep the economy going and to pay people? And we've heard reports of bus drivers and all the public sector workers and that not being paid for months and months, and they're going on strike and they're protesting and because they're not getting paid. And this is why, because the local governments don't have the revenue to pay their workers. So it's becoming a downward spiral. So the financing vehicles were designed to try and make up for the property developers not buying. So how do you do that? And that's where the financing vehicles came in. But now the situation's reached such a high percentage of a high degree of debt, and you're talking that China's corporate debt, which is predominantly state-run enterprises, is over $27 trillion. And this was up to a couple of years ago. Now, US corporate debt in all of its private sector stood at about $14 trillion. So China, with a much smaller corporate sector, even though it's predominantly state-run, and this is how the Chinese government keeps its national debt lower. It's about 50-60% of GDP, compared to the United States, which has much higher debt to GDP. I think it's about 100% or a bit over 100% now, maybe 110%. It's in that range, fluctuates depending on their GDP at that time. Now, because China shifts it into its state-run enterprises, which is just an extension of the government. Even much of its private sector now is an extension of government, because Chinese interference and influence has increased so much in the Chinese economy over the past since Xi Jinping became president, that technically the private sector is almost becoming just an extension of the government. So with that amount of debt in its corporations, they're just not able to keep borrowing from the banks to fund the never-ending infrastructure spend. And that's where the financing vehicles also came in, and that's why shadow banking came in, because a lot of the larger Chinese banks, which lo and behold are also state-owned, couldn't finance it any longer. Or in dire situations like the Chinese are faced with the Evergrande situation, the property market collapse, the Chinese government has forced banks to loan out money, or forced other companies to give money or buy a percentage of a state-owned company or a private company like Evergrande to give them a cash infusion. So just shifting money from Peter to pay Paul, essentially. So that's how local government works, and it's a similar situation to the larger Chinese central government with its state-run enterprises, how it shifts its debt to the companies. Its companies will then borrow money from these financing vehicles to fund the state-run enterprises to build their high-speed rail. And I'll talk about it another time, but essentially what you get over the whole system is, because they're trying to meet artificial targets of growth, which are set by the central government. Say it might have been 10% previously, but now it's been 8% and 7%, now it's 6% or 5% for this year, is you get all this misallocation of capital, which is all these local governments, state-run enterprises, and all these people and governors all working to try and pump up their growth as high as possible in order to hit these targets. But that creates a lot of inefficiencies a lot of waste. It means lots of the money, lots of the borrowings, lots of these loans never return profit and are just spent in order to generate GDP. But it's really, a lot of it is fake GDP, because you might build this apartment block or this highway or this fast railway, and it costs so much and it employed so many people for a few years or however long it took to build, and it gives a temporary boost to the economy. Yep, I hit my target for this quarter or this couple of quarters because I took out these huge loans and spent this money. Yeah, that's great. Tick, you've done your job. You've done your job for that 6 months. Now, who pays for the loan? Who repays the investors? Where's that money coming from? The property market has collapsed. No one's buying your apartment blocks that you're trying to sell, so you can't get a return on your investment. So who's going to pay for that? So now you're having to cut services, you're having to cut spending to all the other services you provide to your citizens in order to redirect funds to try and pay some of this debt. But it's not enough. You can't make up 40 to 50% of your revenue stream just by trying to take a few slices off other areas to reduce it. So it's resulted in a massive misallocation of capital, and this has been happening for the last few decades in China. It was all right in the first period where China had hundreds of millions of people to try and house and build infrastructure and roads for. That was the easy part, the easy fruit pickings, if you like, where they could just build cities, build highways, and that. And there was plenty of people to fill those apartments, who'll buy those apartments at the low prices and use those railways, use those highways. That's fine. But now, since 2008, it's become a lot harder because a lot of that easy fruits is done. The easy pickings have been done. So what you need to do is what we do in the West. You often have a cost-benefit analysis. You'll have all these, the banks will be investigating, if you're trying to get a loan, do you have a good business case to generate profit? How much risk is involved? And all these type of things of due diligence, which in China, a lot of that is skipped over in order to hit these artificial targets. And so the reason why the misallocation of capital is so important is because this is what the old Soviet Union did and the old Eastern Bloc did. With massive government intervention, they, with their communist system, directed all the allocation of capital from central points, which resulted in huge inefficiencies in their economy. And that's what we're seeing today in China unfold on a much larger scale, but also it's a bit more complicated because China has been a semi-capitalist system promoting private enterprise up until about 10 years ago. Now with Xi Jinping, they've really clamped down on that, and the private sector has been getting squeezed out and declining as a percentage of their economy, and a lot of their entrepreneurship has been getting crushed by the central government, as the central government saw that a lot of these private companies and large companies like Alibaba and Tencent and others, Huawei to a lesser degree, because that was done by the United States, but they were gaining too much power, too much influence in Chinese society. In terms of, you think of like Elon Musk and Chinese versions of Elon Musk, that they gain too much influence, and that means they're in competition with the Communist Party for power and influence in China. So China started clamping down, and Xi Jinping put a clamp down on it, and he intervened in much more ways across the Chinese society to clamp down on this, technology revolution, in terms of its influence and power over the Chinese population, and reimpose the Communist Party's ideals and such things as like Xi Jinping thought, which is required study even in Chinese corporations, let alone universities and schools, and it's required. It's required teaching basically. So you have this situation where China is now basically erecting it's almost like the Berlin Wall, but in terms of its technology and its the internet, with blocking and censorship and lack of transparency and clamping down on the privatization and the entrepreneurial spirit amongst the Chinese. in terms of its private economy developing, which is what drove its economy over the past 30 to 40 years. This is what led to China's rise, and now they're destroying the very thing which led to its rise. And that's what's leading to this, or has helped lead to this mass misallocation of capital, which leads us to the current situation that we're in with China experiencing massive youth unemployment. The official figures, I think it was 21%, but experts believe the real figures are closer to 40-odd% because a lot of the Chinese younger people are not participating in the economy and they don't count those people. So the reason this is because you've got so many millions, I think it's 10, 11 million graduates per year entering the workforce, and with the Chinese economy slowing down, there's just no jobs for these people. They just don't have jobs to go to because the Chinese businesses and state enterprises are all cutting back on employment because this whole Ponzi scheme they've got going on with the property sector, which accounted for approximately 1/3 of the Chinese economy, is in a steep recession, steep decline. You could probably even call it the Chinese property sector is in a depression. And that's one of you take out 1/3 of your GDP, your economy, and the rest of the economy. You think of when people buy houses. When people buy houses or build apartments, they normally go out and they buy furniture. They'll buy, all the white goods to fill it out: washing machines, microwaves, TVs, and then you got curtains and bedding and plates and glasses. All those things that you fill in it. So all those things aren't getting bought, or people aren't borrowing money for, which means all those companies that built that then have flow-on effects. And then the companies which needed to buy raw materials for that, for the metals and all the different glasses and woods and fabrics and plastics and so on. So it's just a constant decline. And then all the people that don't work in all those factories that supply the resources, supply the finished products, all those people, the manufacturing sector and then the raw resources sector, they decline and they're laying off people because it's just that continual flow-on effect. And then they haven't got income. They haven't got jobs or as much money, and then they're having to decrease their spending, so then they're not going out and buying as much food or as much consumer products, and it's just this huge flow-on effect. And there's been a huge increase in the Chinese rate of savings over the past few years since COVID happened as well. The Chinese are spending, Chinese are saving a rate of over double its rate that it used to have prior to COVID. The consumer spending is down by what was it? I read. I think it was down from 2015 levels. The retail growth is 1/3 of 2015 levels. So we're going back 8 years, more than 8 years, and it's growing at such a weak rate because people are afraid of the future in China. And the reason for that is because the government keeps intervening in the economy in terms of with the Chinese lockdowns for COVID that you saw over an extended period, a 2 to 3 year period where China was pretty much in various stages of lockdown, and the impact this had on the Chinese population. They realized that the Chinese government can at any moment basically wreck their lives, wreck their employment, take away their jobs, take away their income. Created all this fear and anxiety amongst the Chinese people that they don't have much faith in terms of the future. So what do people do when you don't have much faith in what's going to happen in the future? If you're scared of the future, fear of the future, you're going to save your money. You're going to put it away for a rainy day. You're not going to go out and buy lots of things because you're afraid that the government's going to come down and just do a lockdown again. What if COVID comes back? They're just going to lock everything down again. I need the money to be able to pay for food and keep the lights on, keep the heating on, and things like that. So that's where you have this snowball effect of government intervention in the economy. So it's a little bit like when we have lots of intervention in a Western country, in the United States, or in Australia or European country. If the government intervenes too much, you get all these protests and people, lots of the media jump on that the government's raising a new tax. You only need to look at like France a few months ago when it was trying to raise retirement age just by a couple of years for what is one of the most generous retirement systems in the world. and the protests and everything that happened there. So it's hard for the government to intervene more directly without significant pushback. And even in COVID times, where the government wants to lay out large amounts of spending, there's opposition parties and other parties which push back and go, no. Like, you look at the United States, where Republicans and Democrats, and the Republicans are always trying to rein in spending, and the Democrats are trying to spend a bit more with social programs. So you've got that, that to and from both sides, and then you hopefully reach some type of compromise in the middle. You don't have that in China. One side just goes, yep, it's going to do this, do that. Xi Jinping goes, yep, we're going to lock down, we're going to do this. And there's no pushback, there's no transparency, there's no balancing, there's no one there to say, I think that might be a bad idea, Mr. Xi Jinping, we should do this or do that. There's no one there to pull back on the reins and go, no, that's not such a good idea, or no, you're in breach of the Constitution, or that's illegal, we're going to challenge you in the Supreme Court. There's none of that type of stuff where you can do that in China. So that's what's led to this fear in the Chinese population, and that's what we're seeing play out across its economy now. So that leads us to the current situation we're in today. So you've got massive youth unemployment. You've got the property sector falling. They're not paying their debts. They're defaulting on their debts. So you've got a large Chinese investment bank is also defaulting on its debts. So, and how long with all of these huge debts, and most of these debts, like they talk about defaulting on US dollar debts, which is a problem for the world in the US banking system, but it's not much of a problem. It's not a big problem at all, because the amount of money China has borrowed from US banks or the world is not a significant amount. Most of China's debt is internal, borrowed from Chinese state debts, state corporations, so it's internalized. So a lot of these problems are going to be affected within the Chinese internal market. So it's not in terms of the financial situation in banking, it's not a situation where we're going to see like a play out of the global financial crisis from 2008. That was a completely different scenario, where a lot of worldwide banks were all intertwined and didn't know what was going on with all the subprime loans and stuff. We're not in that type of situation. We're in a situation where a lot of the debt is all tied in China, and China will feel the brunt of the downturn or economic recession, which China is in recession now. The governments are hiding the figures. They're not releasing the information because they're trying to prevent, the public panicking and not wanting to spend even more. But with the lack of information, though, it's having that same effect anyway. People are just not spending because they don't trust the government for any of the information it's providing. So, and then you get foreign investors that are all not investing. Foreign investment is massively down. People are just Western countries are just not investing in China like they used to, because their offices are being raided, their people are being arrested or investigated. So why would you invest in China if you're under these type of situations? And you do have companies like Tesla and leaders like Elon Musk and Apple and stuff, which have invested a lot in China, but they're also investing a lot in other countries, and they are trying to tap into that large Chinese market for the long term. But I often wonder if these companies, if they're looking at the geostrategic risk correctly. Look at what happened with Russia when it went to war in Ukraine. If China goes to war on Taiwan, there are going to be massive and immediate sanctions on China. All of that investment in China that Tesla and Apple and other American companies and Western companies have done could all be lost within a day, overnight, practically. Their share prices would tank massively. They would lose massive amounts of revenue stream from their consumers and markets in China, even though those markets are probably under a lot of pressure now anyway, of the way the economy is and the way China is cracking down on a lot of foreign competitors to promote their Chinese counterparts. So if I would say Western business, I would be looking very carefully, or trying to hedge my bets against over-investment in China, diversifying away from it, because the tensions are high. War is a real possibility for the first time. A major peer competitor war's first time is possible since the end of the Cold War, and it's probably at one of its highest points since the end of World War II, really, where you have two nations or two competing blocks which are war could break out at any moment. It's not to try and overplay the situation. I don't think it's imminent right now, but it only takes a situation in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait where, or the situation in the Philippines where the Chinese are harassing a Philippines Coast Guard ship or naval ships trying to resupply their troops on their island, and the United States has ships nearby, and they might be escorting the Philippine ship, which is being talked about now, and you have a standoff between Chinese and US forces and Philippine forces, and it could very easily go south. You only need a Chinese or Philippine sailor just to let off a few shots, and bullets start firing, and bullets hit a US ship and US sailors, and they return fire, and then we've got Chinese and US forces firing at each other in the South China Sea, in the Philippine Sea. Or the US does a freedom of navigation through the Taiwan Strait, like they do for international waters, I'd say as well. See, that's not really freedom of navigation, it's just transiting international waters. China may close the Taiwan Strait, and the US may run it, and there's a clash, and the ships ram each other, and which just happened in the Cold War as well. We had Soviet ships and US ships did actually ram each other numerous times, so there's nothing too unusual with that, but it just highlights the danger of the situation, where the situation could easily spiral out of hand. And we also have to look at an important point here, and there's a lot more things and details to go into, and I can't cover it in one video. And it's going to be this is just to kick off this channel and this internet series, video series, that a lot of people are looking at China now and go, why have they not instituted a massive stimulus program? Why are they not stimulating their economy? They've cut interest rates, but where's, say, a massive $500 billion or $1 trillion spending program from the Chinese government? Why are they not doing that? I think there's a couple of reasons for that, a couple potential reasons, and I'll leave it up to you guys to comment on and what you guys think it could be. China has run massive government deficits over the past 2 to 3 years. Like back in December 2020, the deficit in December was $371 billion for the Chinese government. And as a comparison, the US ran a similar budget deficit of $144 billion in 2020. And this is with COVID and everything for both countries, so it's similar circumstances. And China really averaged between $150 to $200 billion range in deficits, and over 2022 was also much higher because their lockdowns are much stricter. You had Beijing, you had Shanghai, and much of their manufacturing and financial cities in lockdowns for long periods of time. So China has used up a lot of its surpluses it ran over previous decades. A lot of the money it accumulated has gone. So when you think about the Chinese spending, where are they getting it from? Where are they getting the spending from, say, for the expansion of all their military, all their Navy ships and hypersonic missiles and nuclear weapons and everything they're building, expanding their military? Where are they getting it from? Where are they getting the money to build their infrastructure and continue to pay their services when they don't have, they're running these huge budget government deficits, and they don't have a huge social security program like other Western countries. They don't pay their soldiers that much. They don't pay their veterans much. They don't have the same levels of healthcare, pensions, and all this that unemployment benefits and that the Western countries pay for. So what are they spending these huge government deficits on? Where's the money going? So that's what you need to look at as well in the detail. And we haven't even touched on the demographics with the Chinese declining population, losing 7 million people a year. We'll just touch on it quickly that by 2035, China will have lost the entire population of Japan, some 120 plus million people from its workforce over the next 10 to 12 years, if you can believe the current demographic projections. This is the Chinese statistics as well. It could be much worse. And also, at the same time, they're losing 120 plus million people from its workforce. They'll be adding the entire population of Germany to its elderly population. So they're losing those productive people from its workforce. So you're having the population of Japan declining from its workforce, and then adding the population of Germany to its elderly population, healthcare and pensions, or in China for their younger people. Normally it's the children that support the elderly in the way that the Chinese system works. So you're talking about that massive economic cost there over the next 10 to 15 years for the Chinese economy as well, and how that plays out. So back to the question, why is China not stimulating its economy? It's either one, they simply don't have the money because of all the deficit spending they've been doing, and to do so to inject massive amounts. They can only possibly borrow the money, print the money, which they could do, but then that just rewards the developers and the entrepreneurs and that have just lost huge amounts of money with the way the economy is going. So, and look at how Xi Jinping has done things over the last 12 years, over the last 10, 11 years. What is he doing to the country? He has been steadily tightening his grip on power, clamping down on society, cutting any type of freedoms they had with the internet and expressions of any type of thought, the leaders of companies, and just on Chinese society, clamping down on it across the board and tightening his grip on power. He just did some purges of some generals from the strategic rocket forces as well. So he's been steadily increasing his power, clamping down on Chinese society and closing it off more and more from the world. So is he going to continue that trend by not injecting money into the economy? He wants to reduce the private sector influence, reduce the wealth of the wealthy people, and try and rebalance it into the middle class, to try and balance society in the middle class and poorer classes perhaps. Or it could just be he wants the economy to come right down so he can continue to increase his powers over society. Perhaps he wants a crisis, perhaps he wants the economy to slow down so he can blame foreign governments, blame the United States, and that's going to be his excuse for attacking Taiwan. Blame the imperial powers, blame the old colonial powers that humiliated China 100 odd years ago. That could be part of his play, or it could just be this is just the economic situation he's in, and which could be even more dangerous because he may try and start a military adventure to distract the Chinese population. It could be attack on Taiwan, or he may do something less ambitious, like try and seize more land, like in the South China Sea, like against the Philippines, or Vietnam. Vietnam could be a good target because it is not a United States ally, and it would, a bit like the Ukraine situation, he could attack Vietnam, seize some of the islands in the South China Sea, give the Vietnamese military a bit of a bloody nose, perhaps, unless he underestimates them like Putin did with Ukraine, and the world would unlikely intervene because Vietnam is no ally of the United States or any other large, powerful countries. So it could be in a situation like that. So the situation is very dicey at the moment, very up in the air. It's very unstable. So I like the analogy that it's similar to me, the situation either in the 1930s or even more, so probably more like the build-up to World War One, when you had Europe with its various alliance blocks. You had the Triple Entente with UK, France, Russia, and then you had the Central Powers with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, who came in later, but you had Italy, who then also switched sides. But yeah, the Central Powers and the Triple Entente, and you had the years of massive military spending prior to the commencement of World War One. So, and the build-up of all the militaries and armies over the early 20th century. So to me, it's a bit like that now in Asia with the China's rapid military modernization. You got Japan doubling its military spending over the next 5 years. You got South Korea, you got the Philippines increasing spending, Taiwan, you got the United States significantly reinforcing a lot of its areas in Asia Pacific, and it's building up bases in Guam a lot, and it's building up its forces in Australia, with its nuclear submarine program, and now it's going to be building a number of US long-range weapons and stuff in factories in Australia, and Australia's got a number of programs to expand its military and navy. India's boosting its military, so it's a bit like not to the same levels as what it was prior to World War One, at least outside of China. China is probably well ahead of what the countries were in terms of percentages. In terms of increases in spending prior to World War One, not in terms of overall GDP, because in World War One, prior to World War One, you had 91% of Germany's federal budget was devoted to its, or the Imperial Germany was back then, was devoted to its military. So you took 91% of all government spending went to the military. So I don't think we're at those kind of levels yet, but that's what they were spending. But that's for another video. So I just wanted to lay out the general strategic situation and the current economic situation. I'll be diving into it a lot more in depth over the coming weeks, over coming days and weeks, because that is the focus at the moment. And I just want to, just before I leave, just want to show a few more things I've done over recent years, just so you know that, yeah, this guy might know a thing or two about what he's talking about. So as you can see here, there's some more answers I've done on Quora, quite a few ones on China, and I've got quite a few more that you'll be able to see in the future. So let's have a look at this. So in this one, so is the USA beginning to lose the superpower war to the People's Republic of China? Now, these are not questions I've done. These are questions I've answered of people on Quora, because that's the way it works. And this is just a general answer where I go a bit through US history and their development since the Civil War through to World War II and the Cold War and its global superpower status, and through the various wars like in Korea and in Vietnam and such. Even Afghanistan, Iraq. So a list of various wars, because there's been a number of wars where people get on Quora or they're on Reddit and stuff, and they say, oh yeah, the US lost in Korea. It's a big thing to say the Koreans say the US lost in Korea. It's like, well, no, it didn't. South Korea was invaded by North Korea with the support of Stalin at the time, the USSR, and a lesser degree China at the beginning, and nearly pushed South Korea out completely until the United Nations intervened. And it was the United Nations forces that intervened, some over 50 countries, led by the United States, that led a fight back and pushed North Korea all the way out and pushed all the way back nearly to the Chinese border until the Chinese intervened. And then they fought against United Nations forces, and then they pushed them back to nearly the 36th parallel, and they were fighting a bit of a back and forth war there for the next 2 years. But the US did achieve its core aim. It successfully defended South Korea, it liberated South Korea. It did try to basically wipe out North Korea, but it failed in that aspects of its goal, but it successfully defended South Korea, and that was the United Nations goal. So while that war ended in basically a stalemate, it was a victory strategically for the United States, as it kept South Korea liberated, and we see the results today of South Korea is one of the most vibrant economies in the world, and is a large and modern military power in its own right now. So, and that's just an example. Like Vietnam was obviously a loss, but there's different reasons for that. Iraq, while it was a real debacle in a war that should never have been fought, in terms of it was fought on the wrong intelligence information, whether made up or not. The fact is, presently Iraq is still a democracy, even if it's a struggling one. Iraqi government has not fallen, although the US forces have a majority left Iraq a long time ago. There are still some forces there fighting against ISIS and such, and trying to keep Iranian influence at bay. So yeah, the Iraq War, is it a victory? Is it a lot? I think it's too early to decide. Depends if Iraqi democracy falls or if it succeeds. If it succeeds over the long term, well then you could look back in 50 years and say, well, that was a success in the end, but a huge financial cost to the United States. And it could have been done a lot better or not at all, really. But then that's not the world we live in now. In Afghanistan, well, that was Afghanistan. I could a lost opportunity. Really, it was the right war. It was a just war. Afghanistan harbored the Taliban, but it was just a war. The United States never committed enough resources to try and basically win the peace or to govern the country. And really, with the type of corruption that you've got, and the classic example is look at today. Look at Ukraine, who has a lot of corruption problems as well. Look at Afghanistan. The United States invested massive amounts, trillions of dollars into Afghanistan. They've only invested some 80 odd billion dollars into Ukraine so far in terms of this war. But look at the difference. You've got one population who are willing to fight for the government. They believe in the government in Ukraine. They're fighting tooth and nail against invasion. On the other hand, you had the Afghan government, who was extremely corrupt. You had the various tribal factions and such fighting. The local population just, for various reasons, their morale, a lot of their army was just not high enough. The training was just not high enough. The support was not good enough. You did have core elements of the Afghan army that was very capable, very good, but just wasn't enough. And because Afghanistan is such a spread out country in terms of the terrain, it was very hard to supply and reinforce. And once the Americans cut off air support, it all fell in a heap pretty quickly. And a lot of the soldiers gave up. They couldn't get ammunition, they couldn't get paid, they couldn't get money. So why would you fight? So there just wasn't a strong sense of nationalism to fight for their country. And probably a lot of them had sympathies to the Taliban and that way of life as well, probably. So just completely different scenarios, and you can see how it plays out as examples. So these are just examples of things I've written about, and you can see here, like in World War, prior to World War One, France spent 43% of its GDP, and 11% of its population was in the military, and this was 77% of the entire French budget. The UK spent 22% of its GDP, and 7.5% of its population was in the military. So, and then it was Germany, 91% of its budget, of its federal budget was in the military. Japan spent 22.5% of GDP in the military in 1938, and Germany spent 15%. Between 1941 and 1945, the average military expenditure to GDP was Germany 50%, USSR 44%, UK 45%, and USA 32%. So it just gives you some historical analysis when we're talking about today when the US is spending about 3% of its GDP on its military. A lot of countries in Europe are spending about 2%. So it just gives you an analogy, and when a good comparison, and during the 1980s under the Reagan military build-up, the US spent between 6.6 and 8.8% of its GDP on its military, and today it's only spending just over 3%. I think it's down to about 3.1, 3.2% as of this year. So you can see the difference in spending. If the US was spending at Cold War levels on its military, in terms of dollar terms and GDP, it would be spending double what it's spending today, and its military spending is over 800 billion US dollars today, so it would be north of 1.5 trillion if it reached the minimum levels of the 1980s. And that's just where, and that's why you can see all these GDP figures in terms of government spending, just how much spending we've had from World War One all the way down to the Cold War. All that money being spent on the military, it's now gone into social programs, predominantly in Europe and the US, or in tax cuts, mostly for the wealthy. So, and that's where a lot of the government has lost its spending power, or it's diverted resources to social programs. So probably if this trend continues with China, that situation is going to, that trend will have to start reversing, because the government's going to need more revenue, more income, so it's going to need more taxes, or it's going to have to decrease social programs. So countries are going to have to say, what's more important? Do we want some of these social programs, or do we need to fund our defences to combat the threat? But the threat needs to match the spending required. So if the threat doesn't exist, then obviously they're going to keep spending on their social programs or keeping their tax cuts. So you've got to be able to bring the population along to say that, yep, we need that level of spending, for politicians to be able to convince voters in democracies that, yes, we need to do this, we need to change our spending. So it just gives you an idea of the type of things I'm talking about and things I'll talk about in the future, just to give some rough information. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Just as an introductory video of what I'm going to be talking about, and I will be having a lot more graphs and information, and bring up some nice infographic information for people to look at in the future. So hopefully you enjoy the video. If you do like it, subscribe to my channel. There's a new channel, so we'll be building it over the next few weeks. And hit that like button for me, and share that video, hit the notifications so you can see some other things. Visit my other channel if you like gaming and stuff, with Taki and Lance. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.